My first memory from my childhood is probably driving on the tractor with my dad on the farm, riding on the tractor. I was so thrilled, I think, that I got to get on the big tractor, and I pretended like I was driving it or something, or he was driving it. But I guess that was it, kind of to be on the tractor outside. I thought it was the biggest, most powerful thing in the world, and it was at that moment. We were, I would say, lower middle income or middle income, although we thought we were middle class, or we never thought about all these things that we worry about now. But we were quite happy, and it was a nice childhood. But I had 4-H animals and 5 children in the family, and nothing fancy, but we were kind of a vanilla Midwestern farm family, and all 5 children either went to college or vocational school eventually, and so but I did a lot of work in 4-H. I was working with animals, hogs and cattle, and I showed cattle and hogs at the South Dakota county fairs and state fairs, and eventually got to meet President Kennedy by giving the National 4-H report to the president, which is an annual event that's a very small group of 4-Hers get to meet with the President of the United States. So I have an old picture with John F. Kennedy before he tragically, this was in March of the year that he was shot, in that November. So that was a very memorable event. No one who knew me then expected me to run for the Senate. I had a bad stutter when I was a child, and I wanted to go into the Foreign Service. I dreamed of going to India, strangely enough. And I did join the Foreign Service for 3 years, and then I left the Foreign Service when my dad became ill in the early stages of Alzheimer's, to go home and help out. And then I was in South Dakota, and in 1974 they were looking for Republicans to run for the U.S. House, because there weren't very many Republicans who wanted to run for office then, and I did run, and to my surprise and everybody's surprise, I won. But I didn't really plan to be a politician until I was in my 30s, and I was home in South Dakota, and a chance to run for Congress opened up. We had a nun in St. Anne's School in Humboldt, South Dakota, who had been a missionary in India for a while. She had all these pictures of India and colorful geography, and she taught geography, and she had all these memories of India, and so I just got fascinated with it. And we have some people of Indian descent living in South Dakota. Of course, we have the Native Americans, totally different, living there also. But I was always fascinated that Columbus had set out looking for India, thinking he was sailing to India, and when he landed in America, he nicknamed the natives Indians, and hence that's why they're so called. I was a Rhodes Scholar, and I had a student deferment, and I could have continued it, but I just couldn't quite decide whether to utilize it. I mean, you're really not dodging the draft. You just use up your student deferment or whatever. There were different ways in those days of getting out of it. So I could have gotten out of it, so to speak. And I was talking to my dad once about it. He said, "Well, if you don't go, that means somebody poorer or less able than you will have to go in your place." And he said that might bother you the rest of your life. And so that and others. So I just decided to go. But this was before the Tet Offensive. It was a time when Lyndon Johnson and John F. Kennedy were telling us that that it was part of our duty or part of our destiny to defend freedom and so forth, and defend democracy. So I kind of bought into that line back in those days, and I found out later that Lyndon Johnson and John F. Kennedy, neither one of them were probably telling the full truth of what they knew, at least so we learned from the tapes. But anyway, I'm glad that I served. Well, I've got some post-traumatic stress disorder from it, and I saw some rough things over there, but I also saw some beautiful things. We were trying to help the Vietnamese in agriculture, and throughout in addition to the war, there was a big USAID effort over there, and trying to get new crops and trying to help the Vietnamese be a prosperous country, which they are today. But we certainly lost the war. It was a thrilling challenge. It's a daily challenge of just, it's like being at a huge buffet of where do you start working on what. But I mostly serve the people of South Dakota. That's what I want. And then I do certain other national things. But a state every state. You need to work on the roads, you need to work with the Native Americans, you need to work with agriculture. There are a lot of immediate needs that a state has, and so it's a constituent service oriented job also. And that was back in the 70s, and we thought we were going to reform, and we did have some reforms, but we still need some more. Well, that was sort of a different era in politics when I was in politics in the 1970s and 80s and early 90s. The 90s is when it really started, all this personal negative ads, and I don't know what happened. We've become a coarser country all the way around. I think we're coarser to each other, and we're slipping, I think, in terms, but I always found serving in the House, I used to work with Albert Quay of Minnesota, and Tip O'Neill, of course, was the Democratic leader. John Rhodes was a Republican leader, and we got quite a few things done without really being quite so nasty, and like people could socialize. When I was toward the end of my time in the Senate up there in the 1990s, people were very careful not to socialize too much with people of the other party, because you might say something that would be, you know, leaked around or used against you or something like that. So times changed, and I think it's the coming of negative ads. And of course, now this traces back to the American people being lazy and apathetic, being willing to sit there and listen to negative ads. You can blame the congressman all you want, or you can blame the system, but the average citizen has just got to be more involved and study, not just vote, but study the votes and study who they're voting for. And the reason we're in such a mess at this time, I think, is because of the apathy and the lack of attention paid to preparing for voting on the part of the average citizen. Yes, and that carries over into congressional and races. I think that's right. Barry Goldwater was a good friend of mine, believe it or not, and he came to South Dakota to campaign for me when I ran for the Senate, and I never saw any signs that he was anything other than a very thoughtful man, but he was made into something else by these ads. So they recreate, or they remold you. It's the age of, I guess, television and the internet, and I always urge good people to run for elected office, but it's hard to get people to run for the school board, because there'll be something on the internet anonymous about them, or about their marriage, or about their financial situation, or something such. So politics has become a very negative industry. Well, abscam, I guess that strangely enough, I'm known for that as much as anything. I had a presidential campaign for Vietnam veterans, and we were raising money for that, and we visited, I think, about 4 or 5 political action committees, and one of them happened to be a fake group of folks who, if you went along with their line of thinking, would eventually offer you a bribe. And I sort of sensed that, and I said I would never do anything in exchange for a campaign contribution, and left. And I was made kind of a hero for 2 or 3 days. About a year later, when the tapes became public, and incidentally, just recently I was introduced out in California to give a speech, and the person introducing me, you know, he said, "This is one of the great moments in American history," when on tape. Well, it certainly wasn't that. But anyway, for what it's worth, I turned down a bribe, but I don't really think that's heroic. I think that's what most people would do under the same circumstances, and I genuinely do believe that. Yes, at some of them. I was particularly stunned at, and not to name names that's been in the newspaper, Senator Harrison Williams, who was such a hard-working fellow, but I think he just desperately needed some money, and it was very, very upsetting to me. At the time, you could introduce legislation to bring somebody into the country, or to give them a visa, and that's since been changed. All that's been changed. But I was very, very surprised that some members of Congress did accept fairly large bribes. Well, you know, it's very hard, because it's not only politics, but it's also the foundations in Washington. The play for pay, it's legalized corruption in the sense that, for example, the Brookings Foundation has become a supporter of nuclear energy, and I agree with that. I happen to agree with that, but that's a 180-degree turn for them. But they've just taken in a huge amount of money from Westinghouse and a lot of the big nuclear companies. Well, and they have been so written up. Carol Browning, as I understand it, who was a great environmentalist when she's the head of EPA and opposed to nuclear energy, has done a 180-degree turn in private life, and she's a lobbyist for nuclear companies and so forth. So Washington is really a scary place in the sense that you have not just politics but also the foundations, and they all are play for pay. We seem to have lost the old-fashioned idealistic foundation or political party that is crusading, and I think our country is in we're down a very bad path, and we may well lose our democracy over it at some point, unless people wake up and start studying the issues and not just voting, but really studying what's going on. The information is available on the internet and here and there. You have to go to different sources. I don't know how we're going to get people to do it. I always urge people to do it, but until we may have to have some catastrophic event, such as our deficit may get so high that we'll have a great financial setback, but we're already starting to have race relations are getting worse. I remember the time when we had much better relationships between Native Americans and Americans. It seems as though that our country is getting coarser, and we're not functioning as well as a democracy, and it's going to make it. And we're losing our standard of living as a result. There's less business being done. There's less production. It hurts productivity. People's work attitude has slipped a great deal. For example, here in Washington, D.C., we have this brand new subway which just doesn't work. The reason it doesn't work is because it's not being maintained, or people are supposed to put grease packets into the bearings and they just don't do it. They get paid for doing it, but and then the bearings burn out, so then we need a new subway system well ahead of when we would have. So we've lost the work ethic, and our veterans hospitals are not functioning well. It's not because of a lack of money, but it's because of the mid-level and lesser level, the people working there. They look upon their jobs as a federal job that they can't be fired from, so they just kind of slough off. So, but we can't really solve this with any new legislation. It's going to have to be a change of attitude, and that's part of my message. That's part of the reason I wrote my little book. In my way, at age 74, with cancer, which I hope I get a cancer clearance here, we really need to change our way. Well, I think Hillary Clinton's presidency would be a very thoughtful presidency. She's had more experience probably than anybody who has run for that office, other than maybe George Bush the first. She's been Secretary of State and a United States Senator. And I know that there's the whole problem of the Clinton Foundation and so forth, but I think that could be cleaned up. I hope it will be. But I think Hillary Clinton could be a very fine president of the United States. I worry very much about Donald Trump, in the sense that but from my judgment, it's not really the temperament to go into the Oval Office, and I would be very worried if he became president. But on the positive side, Hillary Clinton she is on the issues she's right, and even if you take the Pacific Trade Agreement, I would be in disagreement that she is not supporting it, but she'd still be much better on international trade than Donald Trump, even aside from that treaty. So for trade purposes, for Social Security purposes, she's indicated that she is for some increase in Social Security. I think that she should say 2%. The president has the power to do that, and the Congress can override it. But the money is there for that Social Security increase. And I served on the Compensation Commission over at the Pentagon, and the military got their their retirement increase in TRICARE for life, but these civil servants and Social Security have not really had an increase in 5 years, if you look into it. And we should increase Social Security by 2%, and federal retirement, civilian, by that amount, and we should do it very soon. And that money stays in the country; it'll be spent here. So that is something that's very important, and I think Hillary should, and she will push that. But she's also the best one on defense. We spend too much on defense, and we could modernize some of the weapons systems. And she's studied, she's been on the Armed Services Committee, and I hope she will do that, although the Pentagon is such a powerful force in this town that they back down almost every president, and I think they backed down Barack Obama. But I think she could offset the Pentagon as well as anybody, and certainly much better than Donald Trump. And I'm not going to just trash Donald Trump, but I think Hillary Clinton, on the positive side, will become a great president of the United States. Yes, I think she will be. I think she's going to win in a landslide. I mean, I don't see. I've seen the I'm a little worried. The Clinton campaign is so confident of victory that they are just not very aggressively doing certain things that they should be doing, such as bringing new people into the campaign and so on and so forth. But it looks to me as though she will win in a landslide. I think she's going to win in states like Utah. I am a Mormon, and the Mormons will vote for Hillary Clinton this time. In Arizona and Nevada, and South Dakota may even go for Hillary Clinton, not because of the Mormons, but because of just she's going to be a good president. I think we're going to see it's something like Nixon's second election. I'm not comparing her to Nixon now, but he won in a landslide, but yet he was in trouble with the press and so forth at the same time. But I think she will win in a landslide. I think she'll carry almost every state, and that sounds unbelievable. But when I started to volunteer to campaign for her, I thought there'd be a great need for surrogate speaking and so forth, and her team has decided that that this looks like an easy election. I would caution them to be careful about that assumption, but it looks like it's going to be Hillary.